Hey, folks. So it's been a while, but we're going to pick back up on our where we left off last time. With we were on the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and so we're going to see what the U.S.'s response is to this attack on our soil, and it is December the 1st, and so we're going to slog on with this. See, we have 3 weeks of class left. So this is an A week. Next week's B week. Then we have another A week. We are going to have a test before Christmas break, but more information is going to come about that later. I'm either going to post it next Friday or the following week. We'll see. We'll see. All right. So remember, this is one of those dates that I want you to remember. Yeah, go ahead. So December 7th, 1941. Most importantly, you need to know 1941. 1941 is when the U.S. entered World War II. So you need to know that. World War II started for Europe in 1939. For the United States, it started 2 years later, 1941. So I don't ask you to know a lot of dates, but you should at least know years because you need to know the order of events, right? Things don't make sense if you don't know the order of events. Specific dates are fine, but that's like trivia. That's Jeopardy stuff. As long as you know cause and effect and how it happened, it's good enough. So, when Japan attacked, of course, it was devastating to our Pacific fleet, but also they managed to run a lot of American forces out of other places, such as the Philippines, and they attacked other areas held by our allies around Asia. And so the U.S. response was extremely patriotic. A lot of people lined up in front of recruiters' offices to join the service, just like World War I, just like the Civil War. People wanted revenge. They wanted to stop this because this was seen by the populace as unprovoked. So, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, Americans were unified across the nation. Thousands of young men flocked to military recruiter stations by the next day. Many Americans feared that more attacks would come along America's Pacific coast, California, Oregon, Washington, leading to blackouts and false attack sightings. So blackouts is when you have like a whole town turn their lights out, so it's a harder target to hit. These airplanes were flying by night usually when they would do bombing raids, like say in London, right in England. They learned how to do blackouts because the German Air Force would bomb them. Wherever they saw the lights on, they figured that was a suitable target. So Americans would have our lights out to try to prevent this. Fortunately, we didn't really have any bombings by the Japanese, though they did do other methods of attack, such as get these little hot air balloons and they'd send them off with explosives to try to start forest fires and stuff like that.
Did it work?
Yeah, I caused some fires here and there, but we'll talk more later about like smoke jumpers and other efforts to stop it. So people were very scared along the West Coast, fearing more attacks from the Japanese. Another Pearl Harbor on mainland U.S. soil. Bless you. So there were anti-aircraft weapons put in place. There's volunteer forces of people watching the skyline and being ready just in case there was an invasion. So while the young men went off to go join in the war effort, older men and women and people like that would volunteer their time just in case there was an attack on mainland soil. So people were very scared of this. Rumors spread across the nation that people of Japanese, German, and Italian descent intended to sabotage U.S. factories and military installations. Only a week after the attack, the FBI had arrested 2,541 citizens of Axis countries, so people who were here from these other countries. Remember, Germany, Italy, Japan. Of the nearly 125,000 Japanese Americans in the country, 3/4 were born as American citizens. So a lot of people who were here of Japanese descent had been were American citizens. They weren't just people who were just here and citizens of another country. We're going to get more on that later when we talk about essentially the holding camps that they're going to be placed in later. But just know that, yeah, I mean, something similar happened in World War One. A lot of people who were German immigrants and stuff like that were beat up because we're mad at the Germans, you know. So a lot of people responded to that in irrational ways. They would blame everyday people for something that happened way overseas. So something similar happened here. Yeah, the most important part is our reaction. Now I'm kind of mulling it over in my head, but I'm thinking next semester at some point in the spring, I'm going to have y'all do a project for me. I'm going to let you each pick something that we've talked about over the school year. I'm going to try to get you access to online resources. So maybe you could do an in-depth study of it and share it with us. Nothing's set in stone yet. It's just something I'm thinking of. It depends on how well we go through the content here. And of course, how well everybody's doing. Because I want to make sure that y'all got all of this stuff down before May. It's going to be important. Are we doing high school tutorials? Like they said, like.
They sent an email or a text message out, but
Okay.
I don't know if it's for high school or not.
Yeah, I got a list of middle school students who are doing it, but they never sent me a list of high schoolers. I mean, I'm not doing it. I mean, later on in like next semester, I want to open up tutorials for anyone who might need it. But if we can handle it in the classroom, that'd be great. I'd like to see it. Listen. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next one, kids. All right, so so what you see here are the United States. We opened up camps. There's even several here in Texas of people who were deemed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as president and the federal government, as being potentially compromising to national security. And so this had to do with specifically people of German, Italian, and Japanese descent. So you could say that it was divided along both national lines and racial lines. And so they opened up camps where people were forcibly removed from their homes and had their businesses taken and put into military style camps where they could live with their families, but they weren't allowed to leave. And the only work they were allowed to do was the work that was given to them. So it wasn't grueling or cruel like, say, what the Nazis were doing or the Russians or the Japanese during this time period, but it still was a grave breach to these people's civil rights. So in California, Japanese Americans were fired from all state jobs and had their law and medical license revoked. So it began with the states. states were moving into that. We can't trust these folks. We've had a surprise attack from their old home country. So even if you're of Japanese descent, you know, you're a couple of generations already in America, that wasn't good enough. Banks chose to freeze their assets, couldn't get their own cash. Stores refused them service, and homes and businesses were vandalized. In 1942, FDR signed Executive Order 9066, forcing 110,000 Japanese Americans into 10 internment camps. This order would be upheld by the Supreme Court in Korematsu versus the United States in 1944. The Supreme Court case is very important because, as we're going to see later on in the Civil Rights era, the Supreme Court more than once had sided with keeping Americans, or removing American civil rights. So we see here people based on their national origin, on their race as well, could be put into internment camps and allowed their property to be taken and their rights. Later on, we're going to talk about something similar in the early civil rights movement. However, they done away with anti-business attitudes. So this is like a separate point. Should be a separate slide. So let me edit this real quick. So one good thing about World War II is that during the Great Depression, a lot of people began to mistrust big businesses and things like that because a lot of people were laid off, they were fired, so they had a lot of resentment. However, a lot of businesses volunteered their factories to stop making peacetime goods and start making things that would help out with the war effort. Canned food to feed the soldiers, of course, aircraft, bombs, tanks, weapons, clothing, lots and lots of things, pharmaceuticals to help with soldiers. And a lot of more people were getting employed. During the war, the U.S. paid more than $240 billion in defense contracts. 82% of those went to the top 100 corporations. So it's during World War II where we see a resurgence in big business. And that resurgence in big business is going to last after the war, well through the Cold War as well, up to today. So if you remember, big business isn't really a new thing in American history. When we're talking about the Gilded Age, the Roaring '20s, but the difference now is that the federal government is paying a lot of these big businesses. And so that's a trend that's going to continue on, especially in military industry. Even up to today, is a major part of our federal government spending is in the military industry. Ready to move on? Okay. So, like I was saying, yeah, it was big business. In fact, you're going to see certain parts of America are going to go from mostly agricultural to where they're going to have giant factory towns start being built up, especially in California and even here in Texas. Of course, other places too, where they could have shipyards to make naval ships and things like that along the coast. But yeah, like remember, we were introduced to new weapons of war in the First World War, such as tanks and airplanes and machine guns. But they're going to be definitely be improved upon in the Second World War. So yeah, you just see you have the assembly line type of production like that used to be used for cars. Now they can use for battle tanks. Uh, so you have a lot of people looking for good paying work after being in a whole decade of Great Depression with no money, no freedom to choose a job, um, and just all this poverty and sometimes great hunger. I know all of a sudden they're making good wages. They're able to take care of themselves and their families. It provided a lot of opportunity for women as well, and also say like minorities too, because now that most of the guys who used to fulfill these work positions, such as white males, were all fighting the war, it opened up a demand for labor, and so people who remained behind were able to fill that role and start setting a trend that would continue on later on. So, wartime industries helped modernize much of the rural America, as much of rural America, right? Much of rural America, as the industry increased by 40% in the South and even more so in the West. So, the South, if you recall, after the Civil War, had faced a problem where it remained very non industrialized. People weren't making wages, they weren't being paid by the hour. They're mostly agriculturalist. So we're still growing things, which can be good. It can be good, but it can be, if you remember, we talked about some of the problems. Uh, Poor farmers trying to keep up with technology could go into debt. Um, Growing seasons weren't always good. The markets weren't always good to sell what you grew. And a lot of farmers in the South didn't even own their own land. So sometimes landowners would mistreat them. But as war industries grew, say in places like Texas, more people had the choice to have different jobs, which is a good kind of freedom to have. It's good to be able to choose what your job is. I mean, that's a problem that they had back in medieval serfdom. So it's good to stay away from that. By the end of the war, the U.S. had manufactured over 86,000 warships, 88,000 tanks, and 300,000 planes. Research and development, which is R&D projects, universities, and even communities were funded to aid in the war effort. So this is going to help out with a lot of technological innovations. So World War One was known as the Industrial War because it's the first time where industry really gets into things. However, World War II, yes, has a lot of industry, but it's also known as the Scientific War. You have things such as the Manhattan Project, which we'll talk about later. It's going to develop the atomic bomb. Government-funded research and development projects are going to help develop radar, which is used to help find aircraft, sonar, which is helped to use find like submarines and boats in the ocean, penicillin, which is a natural antibacterial agent, which can help fight infections. DDT, a very human safe pesticide that's so effective when it's used on an area, it will wipe out nearly 100% of the insects around there. It actually was one of the biggest life-saving inventions in America in world history, because when it was used in Africa, it led to a population boom. Because now all of a sudden, people weren't having to fight off locusts and parasites and things like that. They were able to grow crops like never before. It will be illegalized later, though, because apex predators such as eagles they would get high amounts of this in them because they would eat the creatures that ate a lot of bugs. And so they get such a high amount in them, it made their egg shells really super soft. And so whenever they lay eggs and sit on it, they break their own eggs. And then the eagle and populations and, birds like that and owls and stuff would go down. And they're like, ah.
Oh, no.
So it was actually, otherwise that was supposed to be safe, or super safe. And new medical procedures were some examples of the breakthroughs made by the scientific community during the war. Also, you have inventions of like microwaves, new kinds of radios and batteries, all kinds of stuff. Higher taxes paid for half of the war, while the national debt went from $40 billion to $260 billion by 1945. So we were spending. Yeah. You ready to move on? I think we can do one or two more. All right, so this World War II, another thing it shared in common with World War One was that everyday Americans pitched in to do things like donations, but also to try to reduce their consumption so that more could be used for, like, say, the soldiers and things like that. But it was magnified during World War II. In World War II, you're going to have things such as ration cards, where everyone's kind of allotted and allowed to use so much rubber, gasoline, stuff like that per week. There were days of the week where people were strongly encouraged to not eat meat or things like that, right? Try to save meat in order to send overseas for our allies and stuff. Victory gardens to grow your own produce. Just reusing things, recycling, stuff like that. So in 1944, FDR would win his fourth presidential term with Harry S. Truman as his vice president. So that's right, he's going to serve president as in 4 terms. However, he will pass away in his 4th term. We'll see later, and Truman will become president. So, but not yet. Meanwhile, though the economy was doing much better due to the wartime economy, Many efforts were made to help out with the war at home. Government agencies controlled prices, rents, and wages. So they saw this as an emergency measure in order to make sure that the country was focused more on the war than anything else. And it was something that helped some of the projects that FDR wanted to put into place anyways. He was able to do so because the nation was on the side of the war. Many products made of metal, silk, cotton, rubber, and that used gasoline became more scarce. So, like metal is obvious, it's used for a lot of wartime things. Silk is used for a lot of things in the military, such as parachutes and stuff. Cotton, of course, lots of uses there, rubber, and so on, fuel. By 1942, most Americans had ration books, which limited the amount of sugar, meat, gas, and other products for each person. Families across the country were encouraged to collect rubber, paper, and metal so they could be recycled for the troops. So, there's only a finite amount of things. So the idea was try to have it go towards what the nation was focusing on, especially a two-front war. We're going to fight in Europe and in Asia. So that was a pretty big deal, Pickle. And though we gave a big effort in World War One, as you'll remember, we came at the very end of the war. So a lot of the resources that we gave up in World War One were used for our allies. Now it's used for our allies and ourselves to fight a long, drawn-out battle. Let's go ahead and do the last one for today. All right, so like I said, this is going to be a lot of opportunities for, say, women, people traditionally were not able to have good paying wages. Though, of course, you got to remember at the time, there weren't laws regarding equal pay and things like that. So we are going to see some things that aren't quite the same. So as many as 10 million white men joined the service. Minorities and women found new roles opening up for them. Serving in non-frontline roles, over 350,000 women had joined the military with the same ranks and pay as their male counterparts. Many employers found themselves recruiting women for manufacturing positions that were male only in the past. In 1944, around 37% of women were now working and earning more wages than ever before. At the beginning of the war, African Americans were not allowed to serve with white troops, and they were barred from many wartime jobs. FDR resisted integration, but circumstances that we'll talk about later will change his mind. So there were attempts to desegregate the military. so yeah, African Americans had to be in their own units. Now they could have white officers telling them what to do, and they could have black officers, but they couldn't serve like on equal positions. Um, Now, like Asian and Hispanic Americans could serve in the regular units, but they still faced forms of discrimination here and there, of course. But we will see that things will start meshing together. And a lot of that's going to be because of pushes from people such as Eisenhower and stuff like that. But this is going to be our last slide of the day. So that is going to be important things. You may see on the EOC, especially about women entering the workforce or in the service. They usually like to ask a question about that. But hey, folks, that's going to end our lecture for today. And we'll pick back up on Thursday. So see you later. All right. There we go.